Thank you, Madam Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much to all the organizers for inviting me here to your beautiful country. I must say it's my first time in Sri Lanka, and I hope it won't be my last. I also want to signal my gratitude to the organizers for their amazing hospitality and the sheer professionalism of the level of organization, and a special notice to thank them for their efforts at making gender-inclusive panels, which are important contributions to these events, but sadly sometimes lacking. Before I start, I have 3 apologies that I need to make. The first is, if you look at the picture provided in the newspaper, I used to have a beard, I don't anymore. I gave it to Dr. Cunliffe. His picture doesn't have a beard on it, but he's wearing it today. The second apology is that I'm a former military officer, so I'll be using PowerPoint. And my third apology is that I'm not Italian. That's an error in the literature saying that I'm Italian. So having given you 3 apologies before I even start, it should be very obvious that I'm Canadian. I'm also very happy to be here amongst 3 of us total, former students of Professor Christopher Coker, who spoke at this event last year. He personally recommended it, and I'm happy to see that 3 of his disciples are here today. I'm greatly honored to be taking part of this seminar as we try to come to grips with what's been described properly, I think, within the social sciences as an essentially contested concept. Power is never short of analysis, but it's very short on answers. And if you ask 7 social scientists what power is about, you'll get 14 different answers. So I don't think that we should be worried that by the end of our deliberations today or tomorrow that we don't fully have this nettle necessarily to hand. I think it pays dividends to just think about it long enough and problematize it, but I don't think we should necessarily be expecting a lessons learned bullet point slide at the end of this. I'm not going to be speaking about domestic civil-military relations or how particular countries organize their political and civil balance. I'm going to be speaking about international activities that happen with military and civilian cooperation that are used in the furtherance of humanitarian assistance and disaster response. And I'm doing so not in my role as security advisor, but I'm speaking on behalf of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, headquartered in Bangkok. I'm also not going to be speaking about, although I think it's a very valid point, the domestic aspects of how countries necessarily organize themselves, although I think, as former Canadian Prime Minister Lester Pearson said, foreign policy is really just domestic policy with its hat on. I'm also not going to speak about the obvious valuable capabilities and capacities that individual militaries possess and apply to challenges posed by large-scale natural disasters. I think the case for military involvement in humanitarian assistance and disaster response doesn't need to be made. All of you in this room are aware of the unique, often capabilities that militaries can bear, so that's not going to be the gist of what I'm going to speak about. What I would like to pick up on, something that the Master of Ceremonies mentioned in the first session, was that he mentioned where there is politics, there is power. And I think for the kind of theme of what I want to mention is that the inverse of that is equally true. Where there is power, there is also politics. And I think that kind of serves a little bit as a theme that I'll cover as we go through. The outline of what I'm going to talk about is again a little bit about what is soft power, but thankfully a lot of the intellectual heavy lifting for that has been done in the first panel. I think a lot of these issues have been thrashed out, so I'm afraid you'll hear the word Joseph Nye at least 1 or 2 more times. I'll speak a little bit about the other side of what I'm addressing in my conversation, that is to say, what is humanitarianism? I'm going to look at this perhaps familiar but perhaps not familiar acronym, SIMCORD, within the UN system, what it means, and talk a little bit about what that might look like moving forward. Again, if Joseph Nye got a nickel for every time his name was mentioned today and tomorrow, he'd be a very rich man. But we're all speaking, whether we're using his earliest or his latest works, about pull power, not push power, he says. We're talking about the ability to affect the behavior of others by influencing their preferences. We've talked, other people have characterized it this morning about seductive power as opposed to coercive power. Perhaps that's putting a more earthy tone to it. Within the realm of humanitarian assistance, though, how does that soft power work? And in a way, it's based on a theory of action that says, if you want to achieve something, you need to do something in order to influence that behavior. So in terms of humanitarian assistance and response to disasters, we're saying that after a disaster, if I want to influence the behavior of others, I'm going to provide them assistance. And that's going to generate some kind of soft power, some kind of goodwill, some kind of opportunity or influence that I can use perhaps down the road for whatever reason that I might see fit. And that's an interesting idea in terms of what soft power might be about, but what are the elements of it? We've talked about social media, we've talked about things perhaps in the original formulation of Joseph Nye, speaking about things like Coca-Cola, Levi's blue jeans, Bruce Springsteen rock and roll. These were elements of soft power. They were attracting people to, quite literally sometimes, risk their lives to hop over the Berlin Wall and join the West. That was the kind of soft power, that was the kind of attraction that was being used. Perhaps it wasn't strategic, perhaps it wasn't instrumentalized, but I think this is one of the faces that Nye was trying to highlight, that it's not just how many tanks or aircraft carriers you might have, it's also all these other things. How many engineers want to come and study at your universities, etc. But I think more recently, and perhaps this is a natural evolution of things, we start to refine, we start to look at other elements. And this is just one example. At the time when he was Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates talked about the elements of soft power that needed to be amplified within the American arsenal were what he referred to as the civilian instruments of national security. And he lists them there, including things like foreign assistance, civil action, economic reconstruction and development. So I think that's a long way from the original conception of Joseph Nye's soft power, that these things were almost incidental or indirectly powerful. And I think this, by 2011, and I think we're still in this paradigm, very much more concrete elements and perhaps instrumentalized and strategic elements of soft power. I think, and we spoke a little bit this over lunch today with some of the people I was talking to, if you think you're generating soft power, how do you know you've done it? What are you trying to get out of the use of soft power, whether it's in a strategic way or perhaps even in an incidental way? And writing about the deployment of humanitarian assistance from military sources, Melissa Forster wrote in 2015 that she thought that these were the three currencies of soft power. This was going to be the reward that you would get for spending your national treasure, for applying your efforts at actually mobilizing and utilizing the military elements that might generate soft power. You should be looking for gratitude, admiration, and perhaps even shared ideals. And that is essentially the fruit, or what she spoke of as the currencies of soft power, that if you're going to do those kinds of things and apply those kinds of things that we've been talking about today, these are what you're actually looking for, and you might count those up and decide whether or not it was worth it in the end. I mean, I think you'll find by the time we're done, we'll have more questions and answers, as I mentioned, but before I move off the concept of soft power, there's a few considerations to add to the list of those that have already been brought up. And the first one is to say, well, what are we actually looking to do with our soft power? What are we trying to achieve? It's power, perhaps, and again, I think rightly some of the questions from the audience have been, how do we measure it? But what are we going to do with it anyway? Is it always going to be for good things? Is it going to be for as we've talked about, the dark side, or is it only for our own self-benefit? I think a second consideration, and perhaps this makes soft power somewhat different than hard power, is does it scale? If you do one mission a year of humanitarian assistance, does that give you 1 unit of soft power? And if you were to do 10 missions of that kind of similar thing, would that give you 10 units of soft power? Or is once in a while enough? How much do you need to have on the ground? Would you, as a military force, want to apply a platoon's worth of soft power, or does it work better at the divisional level? I think that is something we don't tend to talk about. We don't tend to quantify soft power, and one of the speakers earlier already spoke about the qualitative nature. But I think it's interesting when you look at it from a military point of view. When we're looking at those currencies of soft power, how much does it actually take to achieve those? I think a corollary of that is it robust? If we generate soft power, how quickly can it dissipate? People have talked about the goodwill or the gratitude that certain countries have after a humanitarian assistance mission comes to their country in the wake of a disaster. But how long and how salient is that soft power, say, a decade on? Does it live on in the memory? Is it still salient? Is it still a currency that you can rely on? Or is it something that needs to be renewed and developed over time? We talked a little bit already about how we might measure it, and I think it was very interesting, both that there is an index and the fact that it may well be very, very skewed to existing versions of soft power, where Lego, for example, might be the reason why Denmark is higher on that list than other countries. And then lastly, I think, is soft power gives us the impression that it's woolly and soft and nice and cuddly, but there's competition in the realm of soft power, just as there is in the realm of hard power. Messages that one wants to get out are often negated or changed or influenced in some way by other people's attempts to gain soft power. Within the sphere of humanitarian assistance, for example, we have soft power plays by national governments, by intervening third-party governments, shall we say, by humanitarian actors themselves who have brands, who have donors that they also want to impress and bring back to the table when it comes to the next round of funding. And increasingly now we're even starting to see private sector organizations, private sector firms entering into the space of humanitarian assistance for charitable or corporate social responsibility reasons, again, perhaps as a way of generating their own sources of soft power. So with that little segue, I'll jump back now into the other side of the coin, which is, if that's what soft power is, how does that relate to humanitarianism? Are the two a marriage made in heaven, or are they actually different enough to cause us some pause? These are the currently accepted 4 principles of humanitarianism as accepted by the UN General Assembly in 2011. And if you can read them from there within the green circles, you can see how adamant the General Assembly was to make sure that the instrumentalization of humanitarianism would be removed from its definition. So under the principle of humanity, it's very clear that the purpose of the humanitarian action is to protect life and health and ensure respect for human beings. I think that we would counterpose that with, you're not doing something necessarily in order to get something in return. From a humanitarian principle point of view, you're doing it because it's what's required at the time. If we move over to impartiality, similarly, humanitarian action must be carried out on the basis of need alone, giving priority to the most urgent cases of distress, rather than those perhaps that might give you back something, whether it's soft power currency. You're not feeding or aiding only those people who are the most likely to be sharing your ideals, or most likely to be grateful for you in the future. And then lastly, and this was added in 2011 by the General Assembly, I think, to underscore the requirement within the humanitarian realm, the idea of independence, that all humanitarian action must be autonomous from political, economic, military, or other objectives that any actor may hold. Again, reinforcing this idea that this is not a quid pro quo arrangement. You're not doing humanitarian things in order to get something in return, which I think puts it at quite a bit of variance with the original intent, and certainly the contemporary intent of most of the dialogue that we have around soft power. That perhaps soft power can be generated through humanitarianism or through humanitarian activities, but then that probably changes the flavor enough of that activity to render it less than humanitarian in terms of these principles, at least. I think one of the major concerns within the humanitarian community is a perception of militarization of the humanitarian space, and it gets to the idea of why the independent independence as a principle was brought in, and I think this was a very famous pronunciation by, at the time, Secretary of State for the United States, Colin Powell, who I think was quite honest in his praise for a group of NGOs working alongside the US in Afghanistan, and he mentioned that they were a great force multiplier. I think the gratitude in that statement was well appreciated, but at the same time it sent chills down many people's spine within the humanitarian community that they would be seen as part of that larger effort rather than independent actors in and of themselves. And I think this is where the concern, where those two circles, soft power on the one hand and humanitarianism on the other, aren't necessarily an easy fit. And clearly, within the United Nations, again, there's always this feeling and need to be on guard for any instrumentalization, any degradation of the actual humanitarian principles, and always being alert and aware to that. So this is where the idea of SIMCORD comes in, and I think just to make sure that this is well understood, this is not CIMIC, this is not civil military cooperation. The United Nations looks at CIMIC as being what national militaries do when they cooperate with civil entities, whether they're NGOs or other governmental departments from their own country. That is a tool that a battlefield commander will use to further his own objectives, his or her own objectives. SIMCORD, on the other hand, really is born out of the fact that there's a recognition of the key role that militaries play, but also an imperative to respect host country sovereignty, and that host countries, even in international large-scale humanitarian assistance missions, have the lead role in the response. And at the same time, making sure that those elements of humanitarian principles are respected. So SIMCORD is civil military coordination, at least as the UN sees it, is meant to facilitate dialogue and interaction between the civilian and military actors in order to achieve these four outcomes: to promote humanitarian principles, to avoid competition, to minimize inconsistency, and when appropriate, to pursue common goals. So I think this is a very different flavor from what a national CIMIC operation might be trying to achieve. And I think it's very important as you move forward and look at how your countries, for example, might be by cooperating or integrating into the international humanitarian system. This is very much the way that the United Nations sees its role. Now, that's not to say that individual militaries don't have bilateral relationships, and clearly the UN has no interference if country A has a bilateral relationship with country B and wants to provide humanitarian assistance on their own. That can be easily worked out between the two countries, and there's no requirement. When the UN gets involved, it's only to help coordinate the international response that is being done on an international multilateral basis. And again, the function or the coordinating function of SIMCORD was invented as kind of a clutch plate to work between national interests and humanitarian imperatives. Who does it? Formally, within the United Nations system, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance, not surprisingly, is responsible for this function. And again, the 5 subtasks there are quite clear. And I think if any of you have been involved in international humanitarian assistance missions, you will have seen them on the ground doing things like facilitating dialogue, facilitating information exchange, and then sometimes actually doing negotiations. And that can sometimes mean negotiating amongst the different partnership. Some humanitarian actors outside the UN system, for example, may want to distance themselves a bit from the military and use, for example, only the good offices of OCHA in order to have their relationship preserved. I'll just leave you this last slide. The second session of what the United Nations has put together as a regional consultative group on civil military coordination within the Asia Pacific. The second session of that is happening in October in Bangkok this year. The first session was very well attended last year, and I'm sure OCHA will reach out to you for those of you that aren't already aware. And then I would also say that on the back of the World Humanitarian Summit that took place in Turkey this year, there's an impetus now to start defining some civil-military coordination standards so that people joining into these missions are very well aware of what that work can look like. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll look forward to taking your questions at the end.